September 14th, 1968, 10:47 p.m. Birmingham, England. Roy Orbison was taking his final bow. 3,000 people were on their feet, applauding, cheering, calling for one more song. Roy smiled, that small, humble smile he always gave, and nodded to his band. One more. He'd give them one more. He stepped back to the microphone and began singing, Crying. His voice soared through the theater, that operatic three-octave range filling every corner of the room. The audience swayed, mesmerized. Some women were crying. This was why they'd come. To hear Roy Orbison sing about heartbreak like he'd lived it. Roy closed his eyes behind his black sunglasses and poured everything into the song. Every note perfect, every emotion controlled. He was a professional. This is what he did. What Roy didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that 4,000 miles away, at that exact moment, his house was burning, and his two sons were inside. At 4:47 p.m. Nashville time, while Roy was on stage in Birmingham singing about crying, his son Roy Dwayne, age 11, and his son Anthony, age 6, were trapped in their upstairs bedrooms, surrounded by smoke and flames, screaming for help that would never come. Roy didn't know any of this. He just kept singing. When he hit the final note of crying and the crowd erupted, Roy had no idea he was singing the truest version of that song he'd ever sung. He had no idea that in a few hours, he'd understand what real crying felt like. He walked off stage, exhausted but satisfied. Another successful show. Another night of giving the audience what they wanted. He went back to his hotel room, took a shower, ordered a sandwich from room service. He was planning to call home before bed, like he always did when he was on tour. He'd talk to his boys, tell them he missed them, remind them to behave for the housekeeper. But the phone rang before he could make the call. Roy answered, expecting his tour manager. Instead, a voice he didn't recognize said 4 words that would destroy him. Mr. Orbison, there's been a fire. This is the story of the worst night of Roy Orbison's life. The night he was on stage performing for strangers while his children burned to death. The night he learned that fame, success, and talent mean nothing when you're 4,000 miles away from the people you love. And the night Roy Orbison realized that the song Crying would never be just a song again. To understand the full horror of what happened on September 14th, 1968, you need to understand the timing, the brutal, merciless timing. Roy Orbison was on a European tour. He'd been gone for 3 weeks, performing across the UK and Germany. It was a grueling schedule, a different city every night, minimal sleep, constant travel. But Roy was a professional. This was his job. He had a family to support. Back home in Hendersonville, Tennessee, Roy's 3 sons were living in the family home with a housekeeper. Roy Dwayne was 11 years old, smart, responsible, his father's pride. Anthony was 6, energetic, always getting into mischief. Wesley, the youngest, was just 3 years old. Their mother, Claudette, had died 2 years earlier in a motorcycle accident. The boys were still processing that loss, and now their father was gone for weeks at a time, touring to pay the bills and keep the career alive. The housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Henderson, was doing her best, but managing 3 grieving boys in a big house while their father was on another continent was overwhelming. On September 14th, Mrs. Henderson made dinner for the boys around 4 p.m. They ate, watched some television, and started getting ready for bed. It was a Saturday, but she kept them on a routine. Around 4:30 p.m., Mrs. Henderson went to the kitchen to clean up. The boys were upstairs. Roy Dwayne and Anthony were in their shared bedroom. Wesley was in his room down the hall. That's when the fire started. Nobody knows exactly how. Some reports suggest an electrical fault. Others say it might have been a candle left burning. The official investigation was inconclusive, but it doesn't matter how it started. What matters is how fast it spread. Old houses burn quickly. The Orbison home, a beautiful 2-story property built in the 1950s, was filled with wood paneling, thick carpets, heavy drapes, all perfect fuel for fire. Within minutes, the downstairs was engulfed in flames. Thick black smoke billowed up the staircase, cutting off the route to the upstairs bedrooms. Mrs. Henderson in the kitchen smelled smoke first. Then she heard it, the crackling, the roar of fire consuming wood. She ran to the hallway and saw flames crawling up the walls. She screamed for the boys. Wesley, the youngest, was closest. His room was at the top of the stairs. Mrs. Henderson ran up through the smoke, grabbed Wesley, and carried him down. The smoke was so thick she could barely see. Her eyes burned. Her lungs screamed for air, but she got Wesley outside. She set him down on the front lawn and turned to go back in. But the stairs were gone. Not physically gone, but blocked by a wall of fire so intense she couldn't get through. She could hear them, Roy Dwayne and Anthony, trapped in their bedrooms, screaming, "Help! Somebody help us! Mrs. Henderson tried to go back in. She got 3 steps up the staircase before the heat drove her back. She tried again and again, but she couldn't reach them. Neighbors heard the screams. They came running. 3 men tried to break into the house through the upstairs windows, but the fire was too intense. The windows shattered from the heat before anyone could get inside. The fire department arrived within 6 minutes of the first 911 call. They brought hoses, ladders, axes. They did everything they could, but it was too late. By the time firefighters breached the upstairs bedroom, Roy Duane and Anthony Orbison were dead. They died of smoke inhalation, huddled together in the corner of their room, trying to escape flames that had no mercy. The official time of death was estimated at 4:52 p.m. Nashville time, which was 10:52 p.m. in Birmingham, England, which was 5 minutes after Roy Orbison finished singing Crying on stage. Roy didn't know. He was in his hotel room, eating a sandwich, watching British television, thinking about calling home in a few hours. The Nashville Police Department tried to reach Roy immediately, but it wasn't easy in 1968. International phone calls required operators, switchboards, hotel desk managers. It took time. Roy's tour manager was finally reached around midnight UK time. He was told about the fire, told that 2 boys were dead, and told he needed to inform Roy immediately. The tour manager stood outside Roy's hotel room door for 5 minutes, trying to figure out how to say the words. How do you tell a father that his children are dead? How do you destroy someone with a sentence? Finally, he knocked. Roy answered, wearing a hotel bathrobe, looking relaxed. Hey, what's up? Everything okay for tomorrow's show? The tour manager's face said everything. Roy's smile disappeared. What happened? Roy, there's been a fire at your house. I'm so sorry. Roy Duane and Anthony, they didn't make it. Roy stared at him, not comprehending, not believing. What do you mean they didn't make it? The tour manager's voice broke. They're gone, Roy. I'm so sorry. Roy didn't scream. He didn't cry. He didn't react at all for a long moment. Then his legs gave out. He collapsed in the doorway, his body folding in on itself like someone had cut the strings holding him upright. The tour manager caught him, lowered him to the floor. Roy just sat there, staring at nothing, making sounds that weren't words, just animal noises. Grief so raw it didn't have language yet. Other members of Roy's band heard the commotion and came running. They found Roy on the floor, rocking back and forth, saying the same thing over and over. I was singing, I was singing, I was singing. Nobody understood what he meant at first, but Roy understood. He'd been on stage, performing Crying, taking bows, smiling at applause while his children were dying. He'd been singing about fake heartbreak while experiencing real, unspeakable loss, and he hadn't known. He hadn't felt it. There'd been no moment where his heart stopped, no premonition, no sixth sense. He'd just been a performer, doing his job, completely unaware that his world was ending. Roy's tour was canceled immediately. A flight was arranged, but there were no direct flights from Birmingham to Nashville in 1968. Roy would have to fly to London, then to New York, then to Nashville. The entire journey would take over 12 hours. 12 hours of sitting on airplanes, knowing his sons were dead. People who saw Roy at the airport said he looked like a ghost. He moved like a robot, following instructions, boarding planes, but not really there. His eyes were blank. He wore his sunglasses, but they couldn't hide the devastation. On the flight from London to New York, Roy sat in first class, staring out the window. A flight attendant approached and asked if he needed anything. Roy didn't respond. He just kept staring. She tried again. Sir, can I get you something to drink? Roy finally spoke. His voice was flat, mechanical. My sons are dead. I was on stage. I was singing. They were dying, and I was singing. The flight attendant didn't know what to say. She just stood there, helpless, as Roy turned back to the window. Roy didn't sleep on the flight. He didn't eat. He didn't move. He just sat there, replaying the night over and over in his mind. He'd been singing Crying at the exact moment his sons were trapped in smoke and flames. He'd been taking bows while they were taking their last breaths. He'd been walking off stage to applause while firefighters were pulling their bodies out of the wreckage. The guilt was overwhelming, irrational, but overwhelming. Roy kept thinking, if I'd been home, I could have saved them. If I hadn't been on tour, they'd still be alive. If I'd chosen my family over my career, they'd be okay. It wasn't true. Even if Roy had been home, the fire was so fast, so intense, he might not have been able to save them. But grief doesn't care about logic. Grief just wants someone to blame. And Roy blamed himself. When Roy finally arrived in Nashville, the press was waiting. Cameras, reporters, microphones shoved in his face. Mr. Orbison, how do you feel? Mr. Orbison, do you have any comment? Mr. Orbison, what are your plans? Roy didn't answer. He just walked through them, his manager clearing a path, and got into a waiting car. The drive to Hendersonville took 30 minutes. Roy stared out the window the entire time, watching the familiar landscape pass by, knowing that everything had changed. When they pulled up to the house, Roy saw it. The charred remains, the burned-out shell, the yellow police tape, the smell of smoke still hanging in the air. Roy got out of the car and walked toward the house. His manager tried to stop him. "Roy, you don't want to go in there." Roy pushed past him. "I have to." The firefighters had cleared the structure, declared it safe enough to enter, but the destruction was total. The downstairs was blackened and soaked. The stairs were partially collapsed. The upstairs was worse. Walls burned through, ceilings caved in, everything destroyed. Roy climbed what was left of the staircase. Each step felt like walking into hell. He reached the hallway. He could see the bedroom where Roy Duane and Anthony had died. The door was gone, burned away. The room was black, empty, haunted. Roy walked inside and stood in the center of the room. This was where his sons had taken their last breaths. This was where they'd cried for help. This was where they'd died, terrified and alone, while he was 4,000 miles away, singing on a stage. Roy stayed in that room for 3 hours. His manager waited outside, giving him space. Other family members arrived and tried to get Roy to come out, but he refused. Finally, Roy's brother came upstairs. "Roy, you need to leave. There's nothing here." Roy looked at him with eyes that had aged a decade in a day. "Everything's here. They're still here." But Roy eventually left. There was nothing else he could do. The room was just a room now. His sons were gone. The funeral was held 3 days later. 2 small caskets side by side. Roy Duane, 11 years old, Anthony, 6 years old. Roy sat in the front row, holding his youngest son, Wesley, who was too young to fully understand what had happened. Wesley kept asking, "When are Roy and Anthony coming home?" Roy couldn't answer. He just held Wesley tighter. At the burial, Roy stood at the graveside, staring at the 2 caskets being lowered into the ground. He didn't cry. He just stood there, frozen, like his body had forgotten how to feel anything. After the funeral, people tried to comfort Roy. They said things like, "They're in a better place now, and God needed 2 more angels." Roy didn't respond. He just nodded politely and walked away. Because Roy didn't believe in a God who would burn children to death while their father sang on stage. For weeks after the funeral, Roy couldn't sleep. He'd lie in bed replaying September 14th in his mind over and over. He'd see himself on stage in Birmingham. He'd see the audience clapping. He'd see himself smiling, taking a bow. And then he'd see the fire, the smoke, his sons trapped, screaming. And he'd see himself, oblivious, happy, performing. While it all happened, the guilt consumed him. He couldn't perform. He couldn't write. He could barely function. Friends urged him to see a therapist, to talk to someone. But Roy refused. He felt like he deserved the pain, like suffering was the only appropriate response to what had happened. In late 1968, Roy's record label pressured him to return to touring. They said it would be good for him, that work would help him heal. Roy reluctantly agreed. In January 1969, he booked a small tour. Nothing major, just a few shows to test the waters. The first show was in a small theater in Texas. Roy walked on stage, stood at the microphone, and looked out at the audience. And he froze. He couldn't do it. He couldn't perform. Because all he could think about was the last time he'd been on stage, September 14th, 1968, singing Crying while his sons died. Roy walked off stage without singing a note. The audience was confused, then angry. They demanded refunds. Roy's manager found him in his dressing room, sitting in the dark. "Roy, what happened?" Roy's voice was barely a whisper. "I can't do it. I can't stand on a stage and pretend everything's okay when it's not. Every time I walk out there, I'm back in Birmingham. I'm singing Crying while they're burning. I can't do it." But Roy had no choice. He had bills to pay. He had Wesley to raise. He had a career that wouldn't wait for him to heal. So Roy forced himself to perform. Night after night, he'd walk on stage, grip the microphone stand, and sing. But it wasn't the same. The joy was gone. The passion was gone. It was just mechanical now, just going through the motions, and crying became a torture. Every time Roy sang that song, the song he'd been performing when his sons died, he'd close his eyes and see the fire. He'd hear their screams. He'd feel the guilt crushing him. But the audience loved it. They'd applaud, request encores, tell Roy he'd never sounded better. They didn't know. They couldn't know. They just saw Roy Orbison, the legend, giving them the performance they wanted. They didn't see the man dying inside. In 1987, almost 20 years after the fire, Roy gave a rare in-depth interview. The journalist asked about the house fire, about how Roy had coped. Roy was silent for a long time. Then he said, "People ask me how I can still perform Crying. They think it's just a song about heartbreak. But for me, it's the song I was singing when my sons died. Every single time I sing it, I'm transported back to that stage in Birmingham. I'm taking a bow, I'm smiling, and my boys are burning 4,000 miles away. That's what I think about. That's what I'll always think about. The journalist pressed him. Do you wish you'd been home that night instead of on stage? Roy's answer was immediate. Every second of every day. Roy Orbison died on December 6, 1988, 20 years and 3 months after the fire. In those 20 years, he performed Crying hundreds of times, and every single time he was back on that stage in Birmingham, unaware that his world was ending. After Roy's death, his widow Barbara found a journal Roy had kept in the months following the fire. Most of the entries were short, just a few sentences. But one entry, dated September 14, 1969, exactly 1 year after the fire, was longer. It's been a year. People tell me it gets easier. It doesn't. I still see them every day. I still hear them. And I still hate myself for being on stage that night, for singing while they died, for not knowing, for not feeling it. A father should know when his children are in danger. A father should feel it. But I didn't. I just kept singing. And now I'll sing for the rest of my life, knowing that music took me away from them when they needed me most. That's my punishment. That's what I deserve. The story of September 14, 1968, is more than just a tragedy. It's a reminder of the cruelty of time zones, of distance, of the impossible choices artists make between career and family. Roy Orbison was doing his job. He was 4,000 miles away, performing for people who'd paid to see him, giving them what they wanted. And while he sang, his sons died. There was nothing Roy could have done differently. Even if he'd known, even if he'd felt something was wrong, he couldn't have gotten home in time. The fire was too fast. The distance was too great. But Roy never forgave himself. He carried the guilt until the day he died. Because for Roy Orbison, September 14, 1968, wasn't just the day he lost his sons. It was the day he learned that crying wasn't a song anymore. It was a memory, a trigger, a punishment. It was the sound of a man singing on stage, taking a bow while his children burned. And every time Roy performed it after that night, he wasn't entertaining an audience. He was reliving the worst moment of his life, over and over and over again.